Cool. Welcome to lesson one. Some of you have already seen this before. Some of you haven't. I'm going to do a dictated version of this PowerPoint slide so that it may be used as a reference going forward in the class. Because these are some great basics that we're going to need to know and apply going forwards in this class. I'd recommend you maybe study this once or twice because some of this material will definitely be on the end of unit test, and some of it will most definitely be on the final test at the end of our school year. So let's get started. This is the principles of design, the basic sort of building blocks or ideas that help us make good graphic design, as well as some principles that sort of more pertain to art. But the lines between art and design are blurring and becoming less and less defined every year, so let's get started. Color. So color is important because it can convey both emotional feelings as well as information related to a color, how it appears in real life, such as green being related to foliage or trees, just naturally through association, and or blue being maybe associated with water, the water of the ocean, although this is actually a reflection of the sky. Color is essentially different waves of light traveling at different frequencies, and because of this, light travels at different speeds when it's in different waveforms, and because of this, some colors actually reach our eyes first. So it's important to know this when we're designing something with color in mind, because it's going to be useful to know which colors draw the eye in more, and which colors sort of are more background and sort of come in later and don't stand out as much. Anyways, color is also associated with psychological effects on humans. For example, red classically makes people feel sort of hot or warm if they are surrounded by it. Blue often makes people feel cold. Yellow often makes people feel happy because it reminds us of bright light and the sun, which is sort of a source of life within our world. The colors that we know of can usually be seen referenced in wheels that show us the different colors between the primaries, which are blue, red, and yellow. In design and art, colors that are very close to each other on either side, for example, blue would have blue violet and blue green. These colors go well together because they are similar and they work well in compositions together, but they don't create as sort of big of an impact as complementary colors, which are colors that are exactly across from each other on the wheel, such as blue or orange, red or green, yellow-green or red-violet, or blue-green and red-orange. The contrast, which means the difference between complementary colors, creates a very powerful effect that makes us really notice the difference between them, as well as notice sort of, a complement to each other. These colors go well together and usually, to most people, appear beautiful when used together. It is also easier to see a color when it is in high contrast to another color. It may not be easy for you to read writing if you are reading something that is red-violet printed on a piece of paper that is violet, because there just simply is not enough difference in the colors for most people to easily see that difference. Anyways, color is a fairly simple concept, but its information that it carries can be sort of complicated, and it's important to know that these different informations it can carry can help us actually create effective design. Moving on, line. Line is sort of the most basic unit of space, or sort of building block involving space, that we will be really talking about in this class. You can think of a line as a connection between any 2 points. Now, these points don't need to be actual dots on a piece of paper or in space, but a line connects two areas within space. Now, usually when we talk about line, it's going to mean within two dimensions or flat space, just because we often can see lines more easily defined in 2D space. Now, lines can also, and obviously do exist in 3D space too. For example, in the photo to the bottom left, we see line defining the outlines of two faces. Now, this is actually in 3D. If we were to look at this image, well, sort of what is contained in the image from exactly 90 degrees or the sort of flipped side, these lines would appear to be just one straight sort of line because we wouldn't be seeing the outlines front on the way we are now. Usually in design, lines connect 2 points in 2D space, and they define sort of a volume or inner space that we would want to highlight or look at. They're also just the most basic form of sort of drawing that we can do. And you can actually use straight lines, which may seem sort of boring, to do things like shading through cross-hatching and hatching, which means a series of close parallel lines which show a value of light or dark. And in cross-hatching, we have lines that intersect, sort of like crisscross. And the more they crisscross closely, the darker the space appears to be. Lines guide the viewer's eyes within a piece, so it is important to think of where you place lines and where you point them. You can think of every line sort of as some sort of arrow, even though they may not have an arrow head. Lines naturally lead us from one point to another. Moving on, shape. So a shape is sort of what comes next after a line when it comes to dictating and describing two-dimensional space, which means, again, flat, non-3D space, such as pixels on a monitor or lines on a piece of paper. You can usually think of shape as a defined, closed space formed by a line or by a contrast to its surroundings. So sometimes we may not actually have set lines defining a shape. Instead, the difference between one color or another, or one tone to another, will create an implied shape. What's interesting is you can actually break and cut small holes into shapes, or change the contrast inside them, or sort of tonal value, like in the top right example. Although this is sort of a poor example because there is black outlines, even if there were not, the definition of where the colors end and begin would give us the idea that there would be a triangle, hexagon, and rectangle there. Again, unfortunately, this effect is oversimplified by the fact that there is actual black lines in the drawing, but this effect would work just as well if they were not the actual outlines. This person probably used them just as reference to create the image. Now, shapes can also be seen when they are filled with multiple colors. And they are sort of also well used as sort of containers for information or color information, or used to split parts of an image apart, such as in the bottom left example we see different color inhabiting the different shapes, sort of filling them up, and where the shapes intersect become points that we notice in terms of their relationship to the colors. So even just already applying what we've learned, we can create beautiful pieces of design or art by just thoughtfully using what we've used so far, or talked about so far rather. I'm going to move on to the next principle now. Shape is fairly simple. You should have a good understanding of it just from your experience drawing or learning geometry in other school. So value, which is tone and hue. This is a very important principle. Value describes difference in light and dark. Now, we have two terms for this here, tone and hue, because there are sort of two different terms for the way we measure the lightness and darkness between a color and its darkest and lightest form, and between the darkest and lightest form of black and white. So tone describes the difference between white and black specifically, and also the different versions of gray that sort of come between them and separate them. Tone as well as hue both describe sort of a value of light that is in space we define within our pieces. So if you want something to appear to be in darkness, you'd obviously cast part of it in a darker color, or hue rather, or in a darker tone if we were using simply black and white. Now, again, just like the difference between different colors, the difference between one value and another creates contrast, a difference. And it is very hard for us to see the difference between similar tones or hues. So again, it is a bad idea to try and highlight something or have an important piece of information be either behind or in front of a piece of information, shape, form, line, that is in a very, very similar value. So either a very similar sort of version of that color, you wouldn't want to put light blue against light blue, or you wouldn't want to put gray against a slightly lighter gray, because it would be hard for people to get information out of it because you wouldn't be able to see the difference easily. And for some people, the difference between one color to the next is not defined at all, which is color blindness. And for this reason, it is important to create a lot of contrast in our pieces, so that even if people aren't seeing the exact colors we're using, they can see the difference between them to define things like shapes. So for example, in the bottom left example, light slowly seeps away into darkness in the circle. And the way that this is done creates the illusion of three-dimension. So by combining shape and value, we can create the illusion of 3D on a 2D space, such as a piece of paper or pixels on a screen. And so we sort of get that the background is behind because it is also a darker color. Darker colors appear to be far away and also heavier. So the shadow behind the ball is obviously not farther away, but because of its placement behind the ball and the way that the lighter and whiter shades of gray are used above it to the right, we see that it is a sphere, which is a 3D circle. And you'll notice at the very bottom of the circle or sphere at the bottom left hand, we actually see a little bit of that light gray, because in real life, light reflects off of everything. This is how we see things, because we actually see the light coming off of them. And reflective light actually will even show slightly the backside of something that is dark, and it is that contrast that allows us to see its defined form in 3D. And so moving on to that, we're actually going to talk about form. So form is a 3D sort of shape. It's a defined volume of space. We can achieve, like I said, the illusion of sort of three-dimensional form by using shape and value in art or design together. Such as the example on the right. This is a 2D image. It could be easily printed out of a computer. It is not 3D. What appears to be sort of a ball, a vase, and a dish is actually just a 2D pencil drawing with value used very carefully in relation to the shapes to create the illusion of form. So again, form is a 3D shape. It is a volume of space in 3D, occupied or unoccupied. It is important to think of form or shape as also potentially being something that is empty. Uh, by creating forms or shapes, we also create an empty space around things, and this is okay. This is what's called negative space. And negative space can be really important. Sometimes it's important to have negative space so that we do not overcrowd an image or create something that's too complicated. And by creating negative space around something we want to see, that thing is pushed to the front and become more emphasized. So again, form is 3D, shape is 2D. It's very important to note this. I will be testing you on that specifically in the future because it's important to be able to use this language to talk about your work later, whether it'll be through spoken word or through writing. So balance. We've talked about how weight can be created in an image, either by defining a space and using tone on its own to create sort of a weight, or by just filling space we create weight even if the object appears to be light because it is a lighter hue or value or tone. So balance can be thought of as the way we distribute visual weight in design, whether it be through colors, texture, using objects. If a design was maybe a scale, balanced design would have it so that both sides of the scale were measured equally and were in the exact same place. There's ways to create balance by simply putting the exact same thing on both sides of the image, such as right up top here, where there is the drawing that says symmetrical balance, which is sort of a pyramid made of squares. It is perfectly balanced on both sides, equal weight and sort of shapes and are used. But it's also possible to create balance by doing sort of the opposite of something, or creating something that's sort of like a mirror image that's, again, very different, but in a way that's different in a way that complements or acknowledges the other side of the image. So this is what we call asymmetrical balance. And it's quite often used in graphic design and art because it can be kind of boring to use exactly the same thing on both sides unless we're trying to create the image of potentially perfection or something that needs to be functionally or used in a way that it is the same on both sides. I will read the slide here too, just because this information is a good definition too. Balance is the distribution of the visual weight of objects, colors, texture, and space. If the design was a scale, these elements would be balanced to make the design feel stable. In symmetrical balance, the elements used on one side of the design are exactly similar to the one on the other side. In asymmetrical, the sides are different, but still appear to be the same in some way, sort of through use of opposites. In radial balance, which we won't really be talking about too much in this course, the elements are arranged around a center point and sort of are related in the same way to that center point. So in the top right picture, we can see the lines all go away from the circle center point in the same sort of distance. And they are equally spaced out in relation to their point of sort of departure from that center point. Now, there are ways that we can create balance that guide us through an image. The greatest example of this is the golden value or golden section, golden rectangle. There's many versions of titles for this ratio, but it talks about this perfect sort of rectangle that you can divide infinitely into smaller and smaller triangles by halving it. And so by halving the half and the half of that and the half of that and the half of that, you could potentially go on forever. And this creates a beautiful swirl that often leads you to sort of the point in the image that is, you know, the smallest thing we can often see, or what is placed in sort of what would be the center point of where again our eyes would trail off in that swirl. So again, an example of this golden rectangle is put in the bottom right, and it shows sort of the division of the rectangle into halves and triangles that shows the swirl departing. Now it's important to note that this is beautiful in a natural way. The golden section can actually be found in nature in tons of ways, such as the way that sunflower seeds leave a sunflower, the way they grow out of the sunflower, they swirl in this exact sort of swirl. So emphasis. Emphasis is a way of saying the purposeful use of graphic design principles to make something stand out or be the center of attention. So I will read the slide here because again, it works great as a definition. Emphasis is created by visually reinforcing something we want the viewer to pay attention to. Focal points, which are sort of what we would think of as centers of attention, are areas of interest that the viewer's eyes skip to within an image or easily go to quickly. The strongest focal point is the greatest visual weight in the dominant element of the work. So it is the thing that our eyes sort of usually end up on and sort of can't escape and are forced to look at within a piece. Elements of secondary importance could be termed subdominant or less important. And elements with the least visual weight are subordinate. Isolation, leading lines, convergence, contrast, anomaly, size, placement, framing, and focus, and depth of field, and the absence of focal points are strategies that are used to create degrees of importance. So I'll summarize this because this is a lot of terms. So convergence means when lines or shapes intersect or sort of arrive in the same area. So that would mean sort of where they are clumped together or interact. We'd usually look at this point because it is the meeting point of many objects. You could also use contrast, which is again sort of a difference between light and dark in an image, or maybe the difference between space being filled and space not being filled. Anomaly means something that sort of does not fit or is strange to the eye or the mind and is maybe not perceived as something that would normally be in an image. Size is obvious. It is a sort of an object's relation to its space. Placement is obvious. Again, it just means where something is within space. Framing is how something is put in relation to the things around it, or sort of how we center something in terms of its importance in relation to the actual sort of picture frame around it. Depth of field and focus refer to more camera techniques, but these refer to when something is either made to appear blurry, close up, or far away. Sometimes you'd want something to be the focus of attention that's very close up. For example, the little girl in this photo is more close up than the trees. And so not only that, but the fact that she's in color makes her stand out. But we might do this to the opposite extent. We might have a totally colored photo with a giant mountain in the background that is gray and black. And if we made this giant mountain the right size, placed it well, and framed it well, it could easily be the emphasized point. So again, this is something that's very important because it helps you think of how to make your audience look at what you want them to within your work. And your understanding of this is going to be quite important going on. I'm going to be asking you for sure what strategies you use to provide emphasis within your work later. So again, think about this a lot. Variety. So variety is self-explanatory in a way. It means the use of several different techniques or sort of many different single objects or things for a viewer's eye to look through. This holds people's attention. By having a picture that is more complicated, or maybe even if it is not complicated, has a lot of variety. We're going to see an example of this later, and I'll bring it up in the slides. This keeps people's attention. They are forced to look at things to sort of try and understand the totality of something. So, for example, here we have the same picture of some flowers, but it is cut up into a variety of different perspectives and sort of viewpoints. So again, even though this would be sort of a normal, boring image to look at potentially, our eyes are sort of forced to want to look at it all to sort of understand how the image comes together. So rhythm. Rhythm is created when one or more elements of design are used repeatedly to create a feeling of organized movement. So again, repetition creating movement. That's what you must think of when you think of rhythm. Rhythm can be sort of on a beat that is exact, or it can be gradually going up or down. Or it can be sporadic, such as, let me do clicks, for example. So in music, the most basic rhythm is the 4/4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. But sometimes we might have something that speeds up and slows down, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then sometimes we may have something that ramps up, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now this is obviously sort of vocal cues or examples of rhythm, but here we are talking about visual or image-based examples. So an example of something slowly ramping up or slowing down would be the example in the bottom left, where blocks are slowly knocking each other all over. And an example of more sort of continuous rhythm can be viewed in the bottom right, where we see the same pattern of up and down repeating in the pencil's placement. But what's interesting is we actually see variety in the colors, and that keeps us interested in what would be a pretty boring image in black and white. Okay, so pattern. Pattern is a repetition of an object or symbol all over a piece of work. Patterns usually sort of follow a rule of some sort, and again, this is about a repetition of that order or rule over and over and over again. It can be important to use patterns sometimes to try and really force something to be obvious, or just sort of to make something do the opposite and sit in the background, so that it becomes more of a secondary bit of importance within the emphasis of a piece. Patterns, again, create variety within image, but in a way that is structured enough that they do not disturb sort of the natural order of a piece. So again, we've talked about repetition a lot. Here it is. And actually a great example of variety here is this picture of paper. So repetition does not have to be completely symmetrically balanced or follow a rhythm per se. So repetition works with a pattern or sort of movement to make a work of art seem active. The repetition of elements of design create a sort of unity, which means a sense of wholeness or togetherness within a work of art or design. So in the bottom left corner, rather, we have a repeating pattern, but a variety of colors are used to create a difference and variety within the repetition. Now, variety is used in an exactly rhythmically placed piece of paper that is crumpled and placed, crumpled, placed, crumpled, placed, to create sort of somewhat of a pattern that's not exactly the same thing repeating. This would be a better example of variety and repetition than it would pattern, but to the eye, upon your first look, you may think of this and think, oh, it is just a simple pattern. But it is actually a variety of sort of, again, a boring thing that is made interesting by the way it is repeated carefully. And we actually can see points of emphasis here. There are parts of the paper that are more colored, that are occasionally crumpled in a way that they appear to be at the forefront of the image, such as near the middle left of the photo, we see a red crumpled piece of paper that sort of sticks out and draws our eye in the end after we look over the grid. Another example of sort of sporadic and random looking repetition would be the use of the pencils in what appears to be maybe a pattern, but maybe not, in the bottom right. Okay, so movement is the path of a viewer's eyes through a piece of work, whether it be graphic design or art, often by creating focal areas, so not a defined, emphasized point, but points that do stand out. Such movement can be directed along lines, edges, shape, and color within a work of art or design. So you can either use lines, patterns, or really whatever design principle to create movement, so long as it makes us aware of a path between 2 points in space. So the different colored shapes in the bottom left image lead us from lightest to darkest from sort of the path of the man as he's running to the basketball he's holding, in a way that makes it feel as if potentially the basketball is what's pushing him forward. So this image is sort of showing us the power of the basketball within the sport of basketball, and sort of its importance within the picture is cemented by the way it is emphasized by being very different than the rest of the colors in the piece. Even the man, who is of a darker skin tone, is illustrated using a lot of bright colors to show where the light hits his skin. And so it is interesting to note that the basketball is actually fairly illustrated in a way that looks like the real colors of a basketball, but it is the movement of the image leading up to it that creates its cemented point as the emphasized main focal point. Another example of movement that is sort of all throughout an image, but again leads us to one point, is on the right, and it shows how, again, simple use of lines and repetition can sort of pull us around an image in a way that looks pretty all over the place and sort of very fast. I imagine a ball rolling across these lines very quickly. But again, we have an emphasized point that is the darkest in the sort of, again, middle left, where the lines sort of converge and the movement seems to almost halt at these big curves, or even the straightaway point that a bigger curve is going around. And anyways, that's the end, guys. Thank you. I'd like you to really think of this stuff as we work going forward. It'll be important, and you will be quizzed on your understanding of this stuff. So thank you very much. Make sure to review this at least once.